Felix Dennis lived in a rat-infested apartment in London without heating, electricity, and running hot water. He often exited his apartment through a drain pipe to avoid meeting his landlady in the hallway because he owed rent. He was so poor that he had to rely on his girlfriend for food. This girlfriend would later leave Felix to date his friend who had just bought a new car. Fast forward to a few years later, Felix became so wealthy that he admitted to squandering $100 million on private jets, vintage French wines, and a bevy of exotic. So, how did this hippie go from abject poverty to become king of the publishing world, amassing a fortune of £500 million? This is the outrageous story of how one man's determination and extreme ambition took him from the streets of Soho to the top of the world. Subscribe and enjoy. Born on May 27, 1947, in Kingston-upon-Thames, London, Felix's early life was anything but glamorous. Raised by a single mother, he grew up in a modest home in Surrey after his father abandoned them when he was just 4 years old. The post-war years were tough in England, and young Felix learned to fight for everything. Sometimes literally, he wasn't what most would call a model student. He attended a series of schools and eventually earned a place at Harrow Art School. However, his passion wasn't in academia. It was in performance, arts, and music. He played in a rhythm and blues band and soaked up the wild counterculture spirit of the 1960s, aligning himself with the hippie movement, anti-establishment politics, and free speech advocacy. In 1967, after his dream of becoming an R&B singer didn't materialize, and being tired of stealing food and not having money for rent, Felix walked into the office of a magazine publisher to beg for a job. That publisher was called Oz, a radical underground magazine, originally started in Australia. It was a heady time in British culture. Youth rebellion, and political protest were boiling over. Oz captured that spirit, often pushing the boundaries of taste and legality. In a bid to get rid of Felix, the publisher told him that he would only consider giving him the job if he could sell thousands of unsellable magazines stacked in their office. Thinking it would be impossible for Felix to do, Felix accepted the challenge and came up with a plan. Aware that it would be very difficult to sell those magazines himself, Felix got some girlfriends to dress up in the shortest skirts they owned and approach every young guy on London's fashionable King's Road with a big smile and the following words: "Hi, have you got your copy of Oz this month yet?" The magazine sold out in a few hours and Felix made a profit of £100. A huge amount for him at the time, and also got the job at Oz. He flourished at OZ, where he started as a designer and progressed to a co-editor role. However, that success did not last long. Felix, alongside co-editors Richard Neville and Jim Anderson, was arrested and tried in what became the longest obscenity trial in British history. The offense? Publishing the infamous School Kids issue, which included risque content curated by teenagers. Dennis, then just 24, was sentenced to 9 months in prison, though he was later acquitted on appeal. Shortly after this ordeal, Oz magazine shut down and Felix, once again, found himself jobless and penniless. Felix Dennis received a few job offers in the world of magazines and publishing, but he stubbornly turned all of them down. He was no longer interested in working for someone else. He wanted to become his own boss, and make his own money. According to Felix, a regular paycheck is like in the sense that it is addictive. To him, there is absolutely nothing more likely to dampen the prospects of becoming rich than a nice, fat, regular salary check. And that's because working too long for other people can blunt your desire to take risks. So, without a job and source of income, Felix couldn't afford to pay his bills. Remember that drain pipe I mentioned at the beginning of this video? It once again became the exit from his apartment because rent was always overdue. His girlfriend, who he described as one he loved as only the young could love, had tried to convince him to get a job, but Felix wouldn't budge. On one gloomy evening, inside the darkness that was Felix's apartment, his power supply had been cut because he owed electricity bill. His girlfriend bought him dinner and tried to convince him to accept the job offer that he'd received. "You are still young," she said. "You can work for someone for a few years and then start your own business," she argued. But Felix refused. He tried to convince her that all he needed was just the capital to start. "I know that I can run a successful magazine," he retorted. "I just need a little time, and I'll convince someone to lend me the startup capital." During their back and forth, Dennis's friend, who had just bought a new car, came calling with some beers and cigarette, after which he offered to take his poor friend's girlfriend to her home with his new car. What happened between Felix's friend and girlfriend after that night broke his poor heart. Well, like they say, money talks, walks. Dear viewer, please walk with me till the end of this video. In his best-selling memoir, How to Get Rich, Felix admitted that the beginning of an entrepreneurial journey is always desperate and humiliating unless you have a rich mommy, daddy, or uncle. If you want to be rich, then you must walk a narrow, lonely road to get the capital to make it so. When no one was willing to lend him money, Felix decides to wing it by deploying his entire life savings of £90. He convinced an easygoing lawyer to register his company with Companies House. He was only able to pay him £20. Then he persuaded a close friend, Dick Pountain, to work for him with no assurance of a salary. He sold Dick dreams and visions for the business. He begged his former employer to give him 2 old typewriters and floor camera, since the business was winding down. He would sell one of the typewriters and put the money as deposit towards an apartment in a rickety building that was badly damaged during the Blitz. The rickety apartment would become their office. Next, he went to Barclays Bank in Tottenham Court Road and opened a company account into which he deposited the mighty sum of £50. He then turned to a distributor, printer, and comic illustrator that he had met during his time at Oz Magazine for help. They were hesitant to work on his comic magazine idea without payment. So, Felix had to sell his albums, which he received from record companies that wanted him to write reviews for them while at Oz Magazine. Thus, it was that the first issue of Felix's Cosmic Comics was unleashed upon an unsuspecting world in the fall of 1972. It barely made a cent, but it provided the framework for yet more publishing ventures. Within 2 years, Felix had £60,000 in the bank, which is the equivalent of £500,000 today. The printers were paid, the illustrators were paid, the designers were paid, the landlord was paid, even Dick Pountain was paid. And so began the rise of Felix Dennis. It was perched on Bruce Lee's metaphorical shoulders that Felix tasted real money and built his first very successful business. Bruce Lee was a cult figure in the UK and Japan at the time. Dennis had the idea to write a Bruce Lee biography with hopes that they'd sell fairly quickly. A kind publisher of the old school, Oliver Caldecott, gave Felix a pitiful advance for the book. Oliver had rights to publish the biography in Hong Kong, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. No other territories were mentioned in the contract because it was inconceivable that the book would ever be wanted in any other country. But something unexpected happened. Bruce Lee died suddenly in Hong Kong in July 1973. Overnight, he became a global superstar, and Felix had almost finished his biography, the only biography then written about him. The world erupted in Bruce Lee mania. His films began playing to packed audiences across the globe. For a brief moment, he was the most famous man on earth. His appeal cut across continents, from Asia to Europe, North America to Africa and the Middle East. Felix completed the book, which he called Bruce Lee, King of Kung Fu, in record time. And it was published in the UK to the delight of legions of ecstatic Bruce Lee fans. It became an instant bestseller, raking in a lot of money for Dennis. He also realized that he owned rights to the book in America and several other countries of the world. This he exploited by selling publishing rights to several publishers in different territories, thereby making much more money. But he didn't stop there. Dennis immediately conceived the idea of a monthly issue based on martial arts, with Bruce Lee at the center of it. He called this new magazine Kung Fu Monthly, a one-shot poster magazine that became an instant hit in the UK. He, once again, successfully licensed KFM to publishers all over the world, but he received rejection after rejection in America. The most painful of such rejections came from Stan Lee of the Marvel superheroes fame. Lee thought that Felix's KFM was the worst magazine he had ever seen, and said that it would never appeal to the American audience. Out of desperation, Felix went to the offices of a British expat named Peter, who was just starting his own magazine company in New York. Luckily, Peter and his partner Bob bought the idea, and together they launched Kung Fu Monthly in the US. Again, it was an immediate success, and for about 35 years the trio formed a partnership that earned them hundreds of millions of dollars. They became rich. Felix Dennis's rise from poverty wasn't by accident. He had a vision of the kind of life he wanted to live and was stubborn about it. His success can be traced to an obsession with building his own business from the scratch, even when it cost him the young love of his life. But within his extreme ambition and vision lay an important secret ingredient, without which he would never have succeeded. That ingredient was Felix's great negotiating skill. His negotiating tactics can be summarized in one sentence: never split the difference. This meant that he approached the negotiating table being ready to walk away if the other party doesn't accept his terms. He never lowered his asking price. Instead, he increased it. In 1981, Dennis Publishing was a growing company doing £1 million in turnover, but Felix himself was yet to achieve his dream of becoming a millionaire. The cost of doing business, debt servicing, and other miscellaneous expenses ate into the company's turnover. Around this time, Dennis bought a controlling stake in another new magazine called Personal Computer World, which was Europe's first personal computer magazine. The magazine was fairly successful. They had dedicated designers and very hungry advertising salespeople. Felix made the mistake of publishing a pop music magazine within the group, but this other magazine was losing a lot of money for the business. So, he considered selling half of his stake in the magazine to another associate to raise more money, but the deal unfortunately fell through. This would prove to be a good thing for Felix because a more serious publisher came calling with a much bigger offer. David, an associate at one of Britain's biggest magazines called East Midlands Allied Press, approached Felix with a $1.8 million offer for the outright sale of Personal Computer magazine. Dennis, in his greed, asked for $2.6 million, which David refused to pay, and the deal fell through. Felix admitted to questioning himself. He wondered whether his greed had cost him his dream of having $1 million inside his personal bank account. Of course, some people around him agreed that he should have accepted David's offer, but Felix was determined to follow his own rule of never splitting the difference. As an admirer of Richard Branson, Felix believed his quote that says, "Opportunities are like buses. There's always another one on the way." What follows is a story of how he came to sell the magazine and how much for. Shortly after the other deal fell through, another interested buyer called VNU approached Felix with an offer to acquire his magazine. They offered $2.6 million with another $500,000 to be paid within 2 years. This was a little more than what he had initially asked for, but his greed would kick in once again. Felix emptied himself mentally and stared through the room. He convinced himself that he did not care what the outcome of the negotiations would be. He didn't care if he became a millionaire or not. "The price is $7.8 million, he said. "That is the price, and it would not be changed." There is consternation around the table. Felix nods to his lawyer, Michael, who collects his papers and puts them in his briefcase. They both rise to leave. Just as they are leaving, Felix stares at the associates of VNU, his mind and eyes as blank as a zombie. "Thank you for your effort, gentlemen," he said. "The price is $7.8 million, and if I don't hear from you shortly, then my next price will be over $10 million. Good afternoon." They walked out into the sunshine and stopped at a local cafe. His hands trembled as he spooned in the sugar. "You're mad, my friend," Michael shouted, shaking his head. "Utterly mad. Worse than that, you have been stupid. They will not pay that kind of money. Also, you have walked out on them. Felix, I am your lawyer and your friend. Let me go back and apologize. £2 million is an unbelievable amount of money. I don't know of any new magazine that has ever sold for nearly $5 million in Britain. Listen to me and let me go back." Felix nearly allowed his lawyer to go back, but something held him. He just smiled ruefully and said, "Michael, their need will outweigh my greed. I am sure of it. Let's wait and see." Boy, was he right. After a few weeks, VNU called. They met again around the big table, and the deal was officially signed. How much did they pay? $7.8 million, and not a penny less. He would go on to use proceeds of that sale to launch another magazine called Maxim. So, Felix's stubborn negotiating skills and his ability to walk away from a lot of money earned him his first few millions. When Felix Dennis died on June 22, 2014, at the age of 67, he left behind a legacy as complex as his character and a fortune that surprised even his closest associates. By the time of his death, his net worth was estimated at £500 million, equivalent to over $670 million. This staggering figure made him one of Britain's richest self-made men, a fact confirmed by the Sunday Times Rich List, which consistently featured Dennis in its annual rankings. He owned mansions in London, Stratford-upon-Avon, New York City, Connecticut, and the Caribbean island of Mustique. While his earlier titles like Kung Fu Monthly and Computer Shopper were profitable, it was the success of Maxim that catapulted Felix into the league of international millionaires. Maxim became one of the most successful men's magazines globally, with editions in more than 30 countries and a monthly circulation exceeding 2.5 million copies. In 2007, Felix Dennis sold the US arm of Maxim to Quadrangle Group for an estimated $240 million, a major boost to his net worth. Yet, what sets Dennis apart is not only the wealth he accumulated, but also the wealth he chose to give away. Prior to his death, he had already pledged over £100 million to the Heart of England Forest Project, a reforestation initiative he founded to plant a 30,000-acre native forest in Warwickshire. By 2014, more than 1 million trees had already been planted. Despite his reputation as an extravagant spender, Dennis managed his financial affairs with strategic precision. According to probate records filed after his death, a significant portion of his estate was placed into a trust, ensuring that much of his fortune would continue funding the forest project and other philanthropic goals. The Felix Dennis Foundation, which he had established before his passing, was positioned as the primary beneficiary. In his semi-autobiographical financial guide titled How to Get Rich, upon which this video is based, Dennis candidly admitted that wealth was not synonymous with happiness. Yet, it's clear he remained focused on maximizing his fortune up until his final years. Felix Dennis passed away after a battle with throat cancer, but not before ensuring that his wealth would outlive him. In death, as in life, he refused to be average, a multimillionaire by the numbers, a maverick by nature, and a planter of trees by legacy. His £500 million fortune was not just an ending, but the foundation for what he called a gift to England's children yet unborn.